Greetings, fellow scribes! Welcome back to the archive. This week, I continue my series talking about Immortal, the Invisible War, talking about the setting. The setting's kind of divided into two areas, so I'm going to end up spending most of this video talking about the dominions. Very little is actually given about the area in the habitat, the mortal realm. So I'll be talking about that briefly. But most of the book talks about different stuff in what they call the dominions. So sit back, relax, and enjoy as I talk about the setting of Immortal, the Invisible War. So what are the Immortals in actuality? They are entities that at some point in the ancient past came into being. That's pretty much the short of it. They started somewhere out in the dominions and then came onto our world, which is called the habitat. Now, Immortals gather a substance into themselves called immaculum. As they gather more of this, they become more powerful. The more immaculum they hold, the stronger, the more that they can do. When you have Immortals at very high power levels, they can use the immaculum within themselves, and they can create alternate selves, what they call avatars. These avatars, by the Society of the Immortals, their actions reflect on the immortal that created them. And if you're an immortal who creates multiples and they do multiple bad things, you're to blame, not just them. If your dynasty, the organization of your avatars you have created, if you release an immortal from one of your avatars from your dynasty, and it goes out and does a crime, your whole dynasty is to blame. While if that avatar is still within your dynasty, it's just you that gets the blame. And Immortals have two forms. They have their form like a normal person, the form they use among the Twilights, what they call mortals. And then they have what they call their Himsati form. This is an animalistic form, the suppressed primitive urges from their ancient past, because they started off as animals. And they can take this form, and it has some benefits to it. Like, they can tailor it for the fight ahead. And Twilights, the mortals of the world, can't readily see the Himsati form. But it's got a major downside, namely that the more powerful Immortals, an entity called the Sanguinary, likes to manipulate the Himsati forms. There's also the fact that the Himsati forms are, well, primal, instinctual, animalistic forms. So they tend to not really be predictable in the way humans would be. They tend to be creatures of instinct rather than rational thought. But that's just one of the things about them. The other aspect of the Himsati form is when an immortal dies, when an immortal is killed, in their Twilight form, they revert to their Himsadi form. And their Himsadi form goes around trying to gather up Immaculum through any means necessary to reconstitute the Twilight form. This is assuming, of course, that the Immortal wasn't smart and hasn't kept an ark, a repository of Immaculum that they have accumulated in case they die. If they have an ark, then the Immaculum in the ark can be used to reconstitute their Twilight form. But that's the basics of what an Immortal is. Immortal society is based around the rigid rules of a organization that calls itself the Stratagem. And it basically divides Immortals into a number of prides. Each pride has certain proclivities for certain of the magics called serenades. They have propensities for personality traits and particular Himsadi forms. I'm not going to go into all the prides, mostly just because they are a confusing mess to me at this point. Maybe at a later date I'll do a video series talking about the prides, but not at this time. But overall, the whole setting is the classic hidden world type thing. The Immortals live among us, hiding. One of the major rules is, in fact, that, normal people can't know about them. They try to keep their conflicts between each other political and avoiding the lethal games, because it's kind of a bad thing for an Immortal to kill an Immortal. Now, pretty much the only way for an Immortal to kill an Immortal is to decapitate them. And what happens when you decapitate an Immortal is that separates their vox, their voice, from the rest of their body. And of course, from there, if their Himsadi form pops out, goes trying to gather out Immaculum, or they respawn at their ark. But you've still kind of killed the host of an Immortal. It's actually really, really hard to permanently kill an Immortal. Also, the only real way you can do damage to an Immortal is to be another Immortal whose halo, whose auras, are overlapping the Immortal you are fighting. Which means you cannot hurt an Immortal at range. Well, I mean, you can, but the wounds heal so quickly that the Immortal doesn't really suffer any effects from it. It's only when the clash of halos happens. And yes, that is the term the Immortals use for the auras around them. And when an Immortal is slain, a portion of their free Immaculum, the Immaculum they have contained within their halos, gets released, and other Immortals nearby can gather it up. And that is pretty much all you need to know about the basics of the Immortals themselves. Let's go and talk about the world that the Immortals live in, shall we? Alrighty, let's start this. We'll start this with the most basic and understandable of the Immortals worlds. The habitat. This is our world. The world of mortals. And it provides the Immortals challenges and everything like that. One of the big issues with the habitat is humanity produces various environmental toxins. And Immortals are actually susceptible to these. And they have to go through various means to purify the immaculum often found in the habitat, just because it's been tainted by these various environmental toxins. So, yeah, we have a little bit of eco-theory in here. And the Immortals work with groups like eco-terrorists and all sorts of pro-environment groups to try and maintain some sense of environmental purity on the world, because they need it just to stay healthy themselves. Now, adjacent to the habitat is what's called the blue air. And the blue air kind of connects to all of the different dominions, but it is a realm of emotion. It is swayed by and enhances emotions. The areas closest to the habitat are called the shallows, and the Immortals see the blue air as sort of like a great ocean. And from the shallows, they can see the other dominions and be seen by whatever is in them. And the dominions themselves are where Immortals came from originally. Once there was a great forest, and it was called the Sunedrian. But stuff happened. The forest was cut down for its sap, which was used to form the cocoon for the sanguinary. When one of the prides, the Anopheles, destroyed the malice shard of the sanguinary, that stopped this birth. And the accumulated energy from that shard shattered the dominions. While for a long time the Immortals were dealing with them, trying to reclaim them, tame them, the Shouting War happened. And the results of that drove them permanently from the dominions to the habitat. They still try to go into the dominions, but for the most part they treat the dominions as prisons. They're just jungle, desert, forest, all sorts of wild places with dangerous things in them, including a plague called the Lash that affects the mind of Immortals, that goes through their incarnations, keeping them from entirely being sane ever again. Now, also adjacent to the habitat are what are called the Mantles. And what the Mantles are basically Immortals of a certain amount of power can create a realm that's accessible from the habitat, but is separate from it. They hide it. They conceal it. It's a place that is real, that you can go to if you're an immortal. But Twilight's mortals cannot. Of course, the Sanguinary has created, inhabits, but not quite the same degree, the dreamscape of mortals. This is called the Morphium. The Sanguinary is said to be the cause of nightmares, of all the dark things mortals dream about. But the human dreamscape is accessible through certain means to immortals. And, of course, the Sanguinary's origin point is a place called Sheol, the grave. And what basically happened with Sheol was the Sanguinary had used it, creating a sanctuary for immortals, trying to get them all to come into one place so it could get its shards of its nature back together. And when the Anopheles destroyed the Malice Shard, they destroyed the world of Sheol as it was. And it became a dark reflection of the Dominions. And then was used for a time as a prison. And what happened was the Sanguinary used its abilities in this time to create its droves, its main entities that it uses to do its will on the world. And it attacked everyone that was imprisoned there. And only the strongest immortals were able to escape. Of course, touching human civilization, adjacent to it is the underworld. This is the world of caves and dark places. That is basically what it is. It is everything below ground. Of course, there's the oceans themselves have things that are controlled by the Immortals. They call it Ys, spelled Y-S. And there are cities underneath the sea that the Immortals have created, away from human eyes. And that is pretty much the fast overview of the various realms that the Immortals deal with. So, next week, I'm going to talk about the mechanics. Hopefully, these are a lot better organized. Until then, I'd like you all to remember to have fun and keep gaming.